Today I'm going to tell you a story. From the Dakota Plains, where the wind howled through the mountains and family feuds claimed countless lives, a bride stood at the altar, tears streaming down her face as she was forced to marry a stranger. And just when both clans were ready to draw their guns, that cowboy leaned close and whispered a single promise, words powerful enough to change her life forever. This tale has sorrow, betrayal, and danger. But above all, it is a journey of rediscovering oneself and of a love strong enough to make a broken heart smile again. If you love heartfelt Wild West stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Drama so you'll never miss the next tale of love, loss, and redemption on the frontier. The wind battered the small clapboard chapel on the edge of Dakota Territory, moaning through cracks in the boards as if the whole structure disapproved of what was about to happen inside. Dust sifted through the gaps and rattled against the window panes, while the old stove in the corner gave a single pop and then fell silent. On the altar, Josie Pike stood stiff in her wedding dress, a borrowed gown trimmed in lace that felt more like a shroud than a promise. Her hands shook as she clutched the little book of vows, the words on the page blurring behind the film of tears that refused to stay back. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had told herself she would hold her chin high, give nothing away, to either side of the feud that had shaped her life since childhood. But as the preacher droned on about holy bonds and sacred vows, the pressure of it all pressed against her chest until it weighed. The sob broke free, sharp and raw, and then another followed. Her voice trembled, her body shook, and the chapel filled with the sound of a bride who could not hold her grief. On the left side of the chapel, the Pike clan shifted uneasily in the pews, their eyes narrowing, their fingers brushing the polished wood of gun handles tucked into belts. On the right, the Hart clan stiffened shoulders, squared, ready to answer any insult with steel. They had come not for joy, but for truces, and the tension between them was so thick, Josie thought she might choke on it. It was supposed to end today. Years of cattle raids, barbed wire cuttings, men buried in unmarked graves. Her brother had said this marriage would be the bridge. But to Josie, it felt like chains. She lowered her head, tears slipping hot across her cheeks, ashamed yet unable to stop. The preacher faltered for a moment, his voice catching as though he feared the whole gathering might erupt. The silence swelled until it was broken not by gunword, but by a voice low and steady beside her. Eli Hart stood close enough that the brim of his hat shadowed part of her shoulder. He had removed the hat when they'd entered, holding it in his rough carpenter's hands, and now he leaned just enough to let his words reach her ear alone. One day, he whispered, voice softer than the wind outside, "I'll make you smile." Josie's tears froze for half a breath. She turned her head slightly, not daring to meet his eyes fully, but aware of the steady calm that radiated from him. He was not a polished man. Sun and work had carved lines around his mouth, and months on the trail had left his skin weathered. Yet there was nothing mocking in his tone, no ridicule at her weakness, only a promise key unadorned, as solid as the beams that held the chapel roof above them. The congregation shifted again, mistaking her pause for hesitation. A murmur ran through the benches, boots scuffing the floor, spurs clinking faintly. Hands hovered too close to pistols. The preacher's voice rose, desperate to push the ceremony forward before violence found its chance. That was when Sheriff Benton stepped from the shadows at the back. His coat swung open just enough to show the gleam of his badge, and his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Settle yourselves," he barked, eyes giving from one clan to the other. "If iron clears leather in this room, I'll hang the fool responsible before the sun goes down." A hush fell heavy. The Pike men leaned back, grudging but wary. The Harts followed suit, though their jaws stayed clenched. Benton stood with the poise of law, his hand resting casual near his revolver, his words dressed as fairness. But Josie, through the blur of her tears, caught the faint curl at the corner of his mouth, a smirk that did not match the mask of neutrality. It struck her then. He was not here to protect them. He was here to watch, to measure, to decide how best to use what unfolded. Her throat ached. She forced herself to breathe, but the weight of the vows pressed down again. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw off the lace and the burden her family had tied to her shoulders. Instead, she stood trembling, her vision filled with the blurred image of families that had hated each other for decades, all staring at her, as if her broken heart were the mortar that might hold their fragile peace. And beside her stood Eli, tall, sun-worn, gaunt, but steady, his whisper still echoing through the storm of her sorrow. "One day, I'll make you smile." The first nights after the vows stretched long and uneasy, as if time itself held its breath around the little cabin. Josie slept alone in the narrow bed in the front room, her body tense beneath quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. She kept her boots beside the door, and her shawl folded at arm's reach, as though escape might still be possible. The silence pressed close, and every creak of timber sounded like the groan of her own heart. Eli Hart did not intrude. Each evening, he took himself out to the workshop built against the side of the cabin, carrying nothing but his bedroll and the quiet dignity of a man who knew he was unwanted. Through the thin walls, Josie could sometimes hear the scrape of his tools long after midnight, chisels biting wood, the steady rasp of sandpaper. The sounds were strange companions, and though she never admitted it aloud, they steadied her more than the emptiness of a silent house. He did not touch her, nor demand any proof of marriage. Instead, he fixed small things. On the second morning, Josie discovered the broken latch on the barn door had been mended, the nail hammered flush. Another day, she found the water bucket freshly filled before she even stepped outside. When she led her horse from the lean-to, she noticed the frayed reins had been stitched with a strong, even hand. These were quiet mercies, not declarations. He never spoke of them, and she never thanked him, but they gathered around her like invisible threads, binding her to him in ways she did not yet understand. It was on the fourth morning that Josie saw the boy. She had gone out early to fetch kindling, the hem of her dress, brushing frost-crusted grass. Beyond the fence line, a small figure crouched low, working clumsily with a length of wire. The boy could not have been more than 9. His clothes hung loose, patched and repatched, and his bare toes curled against the frozen earth. Startled, Josie nearly called out, but then Eli appeared at the corner of the barn. He did not shout. He simply knelt beside the boy, speaking in that low, steady way of his. Josie could not hear the words, but she saw the boy relax, shoulders dropping, as if the tension of flight had been drawn out of him. A moment later, Eli handed the child a biscuit wrapped in cloth. The boy accepted it as though such kindness might vanish if he blinked. Then together they pressed the wire back into place, shoring up the fence. Josie stood frozen, the basket of kindling clutched to her chest. Something inside her shifted, sharp and strange. She knew that look in the boy's eyes, the raw hunger, the desperate will to prove useful before someone cast him aside. It mirrored what she herself had carried all her life. And she saw it reflected in Eli's face too, in the careful way he held himself, as if he feared to ask for more than was freely offered. 3 souls adrift each, searching for a harbor. By evening, the boy was gone, leaving only the faint imprint of bare feet in the dirt. Eli said nothing of him, and Josie did not ask. But she noticed he left half his supper untouched on the porch rail that night. By morning, the tin plate was empty. The town, however, was less quiet. Word traveled fast, as it always did across the plains. By the end of the week, whispers began to circle through the mercantile and saloon. The marriage between Josie Pike and Eli Hart had not been sealed. Some said Josie had refused her husband outright. Others claimed Eli was too much a drunkard, still drying out, to play the role expected of him. Every rumor carried the same threat: the truce between Pike and Hart could unravel if the union proved hollow. Josie felt the weight of those whispers, pressing harder than the vows themselves. When she walked into the general store, she saw the sidelong glances, the pitying smiles of women, the smirks of men who thought they understood too well. She kept her chin high, but her stomach twisted until each errand felt like a punishment. At supper, she caught Eli watching her across the lamplight. He didn't ask about the rumors, though she suspected he'd heard them. Instead, he passed her the bread as if nothing in the world was amiss. His restraint cut deeper than questions might have. She wanted to shout at him, demand whether he cared that the town was wagering their fragile peace on what happened in the shadows of their cabin. But she said nothing, swallowing bread that tasted like dust. Each night, the boy returned in secret. Josie noticed the fence lines held straighter, the chores lightened in ways too subtle for chance. Sometimes she glimpsed him darting across the pasture at dusk, a scrap of biscuit in hand. And each time, she felt that same strange ache: recognition, perhaps, or longing for something she dared not name. The days slipped forward, like wagon wheels grinding ruts in frozen ground. Eli's small acts continued: a bucket left brimming at the door reins, mended a new bar of soap resting near the basin. He never claimed credit. He simply worked, and the distance between them filled with unspoken gestures. Still, the rumors gathered like storm clouds. Peace between clans was fragile, and neighbors loved nothing more than the scent of blood in otter. Josie lay awake at night, listening to Eli's hammering in the workshop, the steady rhythm of wood against steel. She told herself she hated the sound, and yet, when it finally stopped, the silence seemed too loud, too lonely. The thaw never came as quickly as Josie hoped. Winter clung to the land with stubborn fingers, and with it came new troubles. One morning she rose before the light and stepped out into the brittle air, only to find the north fence sagging low. The wire had been cut clean, the ends curled back with deliberate hands. Her breath caught, turning white in the dawn. She followed the tracks into the pasture, her boots crunching frost, and found nothing but emptiness, where a dozen cattle had been grazing just the day before. By noon, the whole valley was buzzing. Sheriff Benton rode out with his polished badge and self-important air, surveying the fence as if he were already presiding over a trial. "Looks like Hart hands did this," he declared loud enough for the neighbors who had gathered. Or maybe pikemen wanting to pin it on the Harts. Either way, someone is stirring the feud again. His eyes flicked between Josie and Eli, cool and assessing, as though measuring which side might break first. Eli stood a few feet away, jaw tight, his silence heavier than any protest. Josie knew he saw the same thing she did. The wire cut too clean, the tracks too neatly scattered. It reeked of orchestration, of someone trying to fan old flames. But Benton only stroked his mustache, puffed with authority, and reminded both clans that the peace rested on the strength of this marriage. "If one side cheats," he said, "blood will answer." Josie shivered, though not from the cold. She caught a flicker at the corner of Benton's mouth, the same faint smirk she had seen in the chapel. He wore the face of law, but there was rot underneath, and the thought of it coiled uneasily in her stomach. That evening, the boarding house keeper arrived at the cabin. Delilah Ward came riding in, on a chestnut mare, her skirts dusted from the road, her eyes bright with something Josie could not name. She carried herself with the practiced grace of a woman who knew how to draw attention without asking for it. "Evening, Eli," she said warmly, sliding from the saddle. Her gaze lingered a heartbeat too long before turning politely toward Josie. "Mrs. Hart." Josie stiffened at the title. It sounded foreign on Delilah's tongue, like a claim she wasn't certain Josie deserved. They invited her in out of courtesy, though the air inside grew heavy. Delilah spoke of town business, of supplies arriving late, of Benton pressing for higher levies on cattle drives. But beneath every word lay something sharper, something personal. She mentioned Eli's work on her boarding house porch the summer before, the way he had fixed her railing after a storm. She laughed softly at the memory, her hand brushing his arm as though by accident. Josie sat rigid, her fingers curled tight around her cup. She had never asked Eli about women before the marriage. She hadn't wanted to know. But now Delilah filled the silence with suggestions that left Josie's heart twisting. She saw in the woman's eyes not only lingering affection, but ambition. Benton had promised Delilah respectability, perhaps even influence, and she wore that hope like perfume. When Delilah finally left, the sound of her horse's hooves fading into the dark, Josie felt the cabin echo with questions she could not ask. Eli busied himself stacking wood by the fire, his face unreadable. She wanted to demand the truth, to lash out, but the words lodged in her throat like stones. Instead, she retreated to the bedroom and closed the door, her pulse racing with anger and fear she could not name. That night, long after she lay down, Josie heard the faint creak of the workshop door. Eli's footsteps crossed the yard steady as ever, and then the rhythmic tap of hammer against wood began. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound seeped through the patience of it, the persistence. She turned her eyes into the pillow, and the tears came hot and bitter. She cried for herself, for the trap she lived in, for the gnawing sense that she would never be enough. Eli must have heard. The walls were thin, and her sobs carried. But he never knocked, never asked, never intruded. At dawn, when she dragged herself to the table, eyes swollen, she found a single wildflower in a chipped jar, set near her plate. Its petals were bruised from the cold, but still clung stubbornly to life. Josie stared at it until her vision blurred. She did not touch it, but she could not ignore it either. The gesture was wordless, like everything Eli did, quiet, patient, refusing to force itself upon her. And yet, it pierced deeper than questions or apologies ever could. She looked across the table at him, his head bent over bread he cut with careful hands. He did not glance up, did not ask for gratitude. But something fragile shifted in her chest, something that frightened her more than the feud or Benton's smirk. Because for the first time since the vows, Josie felt the faint stirrings of belonging. It was late afternoon when Delilah Ward returned, her figure outlined against the copper sky. Josie had been sweeping the porch, the brittle air carrying the scent of dust and wood smoke. She looked up to see the boarding house keeper dismounting with unusual care, her gloved hand tight around a small packet. Delilah's eyes were unreadable, somewhere between pity and resolve, and her voice was soft when she spoke. "Josie," she said, using her first name, as if they were old friends, though they were not. "I've something for you. Best you see it alone." Josie hesitated, suspicion rising. Delilah pressed the envelope into her palm with fingers that trembled slightly, before turning away, as if she wanted no part in what might come after. Josie felt the weight of the folded paper heavier than its size should allow. She stepped back inside the cabin, the door shutting against the wind with a hollow thud. The lamp threw pale light across the table as Josie broke the seal. Her breath stilled the moment her eyes scanned the faded handwriting. It was her father's hand, firm and deliberate, words written long before his death. She read them once, then again, her chest tightening with each line. They were adoption papers, legal binding, proof that Josie Pike was not truly a Pike at all. Her father had taken her in, as an infant, a child left vulnerable, when outlaws had slaughtered her birth family in a feud that spilled blood across the plains. He had signed his name to shield her, to give her a place in the world, to keep her safe beneath the Pike name. Josie's throat burned. Her whole body trembled as she clutched the paper, eyes blurring with disbelief. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Everything she had endured, the whispers that she was nothing but a pawn, The marriage arranged to bind two warring clans suddenly hollowed out into something more unbearable. She wasn't even who they thought she was. She stumbled to the chair, sinking into it, her hands shaking around the fragile sheets. Her father had never told her. Had her brother known? Had everyone known but her? The sound of boots on the porch startled her. Eli entered quietly, his hat in his hand, his shoulders dusted with sawdust from the workshop. He paused when he saw her at the table, the papers spread before her like shards of glass. "Josie." His voice was low, cautious. She lifted her head, eyes blazing through tears. "Did you know?" The question came out sharp, almost desperate. He followed, stepping closer, but he shook his head. "Know what?" Her hand slapped the papers, the sound brittle in the silence. "That I'm not a Pike. That everything they've said about me, about this marriage, about this cursed feud, none of it belongs to me." "Did you know I didn't?" Eli said softly. His gaze held hers with steady truth. No flicker of doubt. Not a word. But the reassurance did little to mend the rift opening inside her. She pressed her hands to her face, unable to stop the flood of tears. The vows, the whispers, the sideways glances in town, they all felt sharper now, each one cutting against the fragile shell of her identity. Who was she, if not Josie Pike? And why had her father never trusted her with the truth? She stayed at the table long after Eli retreated, the lamplight burning low. When a knock came at the door, she half hoped it was the wind. But it was Benton. Sheriff Benton, tall and broad, his badge gleaming with false authority. He stepped into the cabin without waiting to be invited, his smile thin and knowing. "Evening, Mrs. Hart." Or should I say Miss, since it seems the name Pike doesn't rightly belong to you. Josie stiffened, her hands curling over the papers. "You knew." "Known for years," Benton said easily, his tone casual, as if they were discussing weather. He leaned against the doorframe, the picture of authority relaxed. "Your daddy tried to bury it, but a man in my position sees things, knows things. The question is, what will you do with it now?" Her stomach knotted. "What do you mean?" Benton's eyes gleamed cold. "If this marriage was built on a false name, it ain't valid. Which means the truce between Pike and Hart ain't worth the ink on the page. Feud picks up again, land and cattle fall into dispute. And me, well, I've got the law on my side to settle it any way I choose." Josie's breath caught. "You'd use this to break the truce, I'd use it to keep order," Benton replied smoothly. "And maybe to claim a little more than order if a certain lady doesn't see sense. You've got no claim, Josie. No blood, no legacy. But I could make sure you keep a place here. If you stand with me." She stared at him, horror clawing up her throat. He was offering protection, but the kind that came with chains. His smirk told her he had already mapped the ruin that would follow if she refused. The papers trembled in her hands. Her father's voice seemed to echo from the past, heavy with decisions she had never asked for. The world she thought she knew had been stripped bare, and now Benton was ready to weaponize the truth against her. Behind her, the fire popped in the stove, the only sound in the choking silence. Josie felt the ground tilt again, the weight of her father's secret pressing down. She had thought herself a pawn before. Now she wondered if she was nothing more than a shadow, an impostor waiting to be erased. And yet through the fear, one image flickered in her mind, Eli's whisper at the altar, steady as the beating of her own heart. "One day I'll make you smile." The promise seemed impossibly far away now, but it was all she had left to hold on to. The days after Josie discovered the truth about her name stretched taut, each moment weighted with dread. The adoption papers stayed locked in the small wooden chest beneath her bed, yet she felt their presence like a brand against her skin. She carried the knowledge silently, but Benton's shadow lengthened across every step she took. He came again, not long after, bold as ever, his boots crunching on the porch gravel. Eli was out mending a gate, leaving Josie to meet him alone. Benton removed his hat, with a mockery of courtesy, his eyes glittering. "You've got yourself in a hard spot, Josie," he said smoothly. "This land, this truce, even that husband of yours, they all raised on a name that isn't truly yours. Now I don't mean to see you ruined. Quite the opposite." He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a serpent's hiss. "If you stand with me, I can make certain you keep a place here, even without Pike blood." Josie stiffened. "And if I refuse?" His smile thinned. "Then the truth comes out. Folks won't forgive being fooled. Marriage void, feud reignited, and you cast aside like yesterday's ashes. Choose wisely." She slammed the door in his face, but his laughter lingered, carried by the wind like smoke. That night, Delilah arrived at the cabin, her face pale, her hands trembling as she twisted the edge of her shawl. Josie's heart hardened at the sight of her, remembering the woman's easy charm, the way she had looked at Eli, with half-claimed ownership. But there was no flirtation in Delilah's eyes now, only fear. "I need to speak with you," she whispered. "Both of you." Eli came in from the workshop, his brow furrowed. Delilah swallowed hard before speaking. "Benton's got me cornered. He knows things. About Eli. About me." Her voice cracked. "Years ago, after I left Eli, drank himself to death. Benton's held it over me, used it to remind me I once cared for a man who might have destroyed himself. He says if I don't stand by him, he'll ruin what little name I've built." Eli's face tightened, shame flickering in his eyes, but he stayed silent. Josie felt the ground tilt again, betrayal mingled with pity. Delilah's confession was a knife, but it cut both ways. Benton's power reached everywhere, wrapping chains around every weakness. "I'm sorry," Delilah whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "I never meant for it to touch you. But Benton, he's planning something. He means to strike at Eli's hurt." The warning proved true 2 nights later. Josie woke to the acrid sting of smoke on the air. She rushed outside, the sky glowing orange, where fire licked the edges of the pasture. The terrified bawling of cattle rose like thunder hooves pounding the earth in blind panic. Fence buckled under the weight of the stampede. Sparks flew in the wind, turning the night into a storm of fire and dust. Eli was already in the midst of it, astride his horse, shouting hoarsely as he tried to drive the herd away from the flames. His figure vanished and reappeared in the smoke, a lone rider against chaos. Josie's heart seized as she saw him, nearly thrown his mount rearing, as a steer crashed into its flank. Without thinking, she ran to the corral, grabbing the coiled rope that hung from the post. The heat scorched her lungs, but she pressed forward, skirts snagging on brambles. She saw Eli lunge for the lead steer, only to be knocked sideways, his boot catching in the stirrup. He fell hard, his body dragged through the dirt, the stampede bearing down on him. Josie's scream tore through the night. She flung the rope with shaking hands, the loop catching the horn of his saddle. Bracing herself, she pulled with all her strength, heels digging into the earth. For a breathless instant, she thought she would be torn apart. Then the rope held, and Eli dragged himself free, coughing, his face streaked with soot. He staggered toward her, gripping her shoulder to steady himself. Their eyes met through the haze, the raw terror, the relief, the undeniable tether between them. The world still roared around them, but for that moment, it was only the two of them, bound by survival and something deeper neither dared name. Neighbors arrived, rushing to drive the herd back, but Benton lingered at the edge of the flames, his expression unreadable. He watched Josie and Eli with narrowed eyes, as though calculating how much stronger they had become by surviving what should have destroyed them. Then he turned and vanished into the dark. When at last the fire was contained and the cattle corralled, Josie sank to the ground, trembling with exhaustion. Eli knelt beside her, his hand hovering before finally resting gently on hers. No words passed between them. None were needed. Josie felt the truth of it deep in her chest. Benton had tried to break them, but instead had tied them closer together. The feud still smoldered, the threat still lingered, yet she knew she could no longer think of Eli as only a stranger bound by vows. He had nearly given his life to protect what was theirs, and she had risked her own to pull him back. For the first time, Josie realized she no longer feared the whisper he had given her on their wedding day. She almost believed it. "One day I'll make you smile." The trial was no trial at all, just a gathering in the livery stable, the scent of hay and horse sweat thick in the air. The townsfolk crowded onto barrels and fence rails, faces drawn tight with anticipation. Men from both the Pike and Hart clans pressed shoulder to shoulder, their distrust simmering, waiting for the faintest spark to ignite. Above them all stood Sheriff Benton, his badge gleaming in the lantern light, papers clutched in his hand like a weapon. He raised his voice so all could hear. "These are the adoption papers," he declared, shaking them for emphasis. "Signed years ago by Josie's late father. Proof enough that Josie Pike ain't a Pike at all. Which means her marriage to Eli Hart is void, the truce between clans nothing but smoke. By law, this land falls into dispute." The murmur that followed rolled through the crowd like distant thunder. Faces turned toward Josie, some wide with pity, others narrowing with contempt. She stood rigid, her breath locked in her chest, her hands knotted at her sides. The words cut sharper than the winter wind. Not a Pike, not a wife, not anything. Eli stepped forward, shoulders squared, but Benton's hand brushed the butt of his revolver in warning. "Careful now, Hart. The law's on my side." Benton turned back to the crowd, his voice oily with confidence. "What we've got here is a fraud. A woman parading under a name that don't belong to her, uniting families under false pretenses. This town deserves better." Josie's vision blurred with hot tears, but before despair could root deep, another voice rang out. "No, Sheriff. This town deserves the truth." Every head turned as Delilah Ward stepped into the lantern glow. She wore no fine dress, only a plain wool skirt and shawl, her hair loose from its pins. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a light Josie had never seen before. She clutched a folded packet of her own. "I've kept silent long enough," Delilah said, her voice trembling, but loud enough to carry. "Benton speaks of law, but he forges it to his liking. Those adoption papers, he tampered with them same as he tampered with the deeds and the cattle tallies. He orchestrated the thefts, the fires, all to pit Pike against Hart, while he cleaned his own pockets." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Benton's face darkened. "Lies," he barked. "Jealous woman's lies." Delilah shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "I stood by him once out of fear and foolish hope, but I won't anymore. He promised me respectability. What he gave me was shame. I won't let him take this valley too." She threw her packet onto the table. Inside were copies of contracts altered in Benton's handwriting. Proof. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then a small trembling voice spoke. "She's telling the truth." All eyes dropped to where Tommy stood at the edge of the crowd. The boy's clothes were torn, his face smudged, but his chin was high. In his hands, he held a crumpled page, edges singed from fire. "I found this in the yard after the stampede," he said, holding it out. Sheriff dropped it. "I didn't understand it first, but now I do. It's his ledger. Names, numbers. The money he took for cattle never sold." The stable filled with murmurs again, louder now, angrier. Benton lunged forward, but Eli stepped between him and the boy, his stance unyielding. Benton's hand twitched near his gun, yet he froze when half a dozen more hands in the crowd mirrored the motion. For once, the lawman found himself outnumbered. Josie's chest heaved, her heart pounding with terror and clarity. She looked at Benton, at the clans, at all the faces that had judged her. Her whole life, she had been treated as a piece to bargain with, a name to wield. But no longer. She stepped forward, her voice ringing clear, despite the tears streaking her cheeks. You think I'm nothing because I wasn't born a Pike. You think my worth is in blood. But I'll tell you what matters not. Blood, not a name carved in ink. It's choice. It's love. It's who stays when the world would see you cast out. That's family. And I choose Eli. I choose the boy who risked himself to tell the truth. I choose the life we've built, fragile, but real. That is my name. That is who I am. The words hung in the smoky air, undeniable. Eli's eyes found hers across the lantern light, steady as they had been on the day he whispered his promise. He stepped closer, his voice low, but straight. Family ain't who names you. It's who stays. And I'm staying, Josie, always. The crowd shifted. Men who had come ready for blood lowered their hands. Women nodded through tears. Even hardened Pike and Hart elders exchanged glances, the weight of old hatred faltering under Josie's stand. Benton sputtered, searching for authority that no longer belonged to him. He reached for his gun, but before he could draw, two townsmen seized his arms. The crowd surged, not in violence, but in unity, voices rising with condemnation. The sheriff's badge gleamed dull in the lantern light, no longer a symbol of power, but of betrayal. Benton was dragged from the stable, his protests drowned in the roar of voices demanding justice. For the first time in years, the clans stood together, not against each other, but against the man who had poisoned them. Josie swayed, the weight of what she had spoken settling over her. Then Eli's arm was around her shoulders, steady and warm. Tommy pressed close to her other side, his small hand gripping hers with fierce determination. Delilah stood apart, tears still streaming, but Josie met her gaze and saw something like peace. The lantern light flickered over them all, casting shadows long and deep. But in Josie's heart, for the first time, there was no shadow. Only the fragile, burning truth. She belonged not because of a name, but because she had chosen and been chosen in return. The livery stable emptied slowly after the shouting died down, boots crunching over straw, as the clans drifted into the night. Benton was hauled away in disgrace, his badge ripped from his chest by the very men who once deferred to him. He spat and cursed, but his voice carried no authority now. He was finished, a lawman stripped bare, before the community he had poisoned. Josie watched him go, her breath catching in relief. For so long his shadow had hung over her like a storm cloud waiting to break. Now the air felt lighter, though her hands still trembled from the weight of what had passed. She leaned into Eli's side, his presence steady, a wall of strength she no longer resisted. The feud that had bound their lives so tightly seemed suddenly thin, like an old rope fraying at the edges. Without Benton stoking suspicion, what reason remained for Pike and Hart to bare their teeth at one another? Already, Josie could hear murmurs among the men, talk of cattle needing to be rounded, fence needing mending. Not as rivals, but as neighbors. Perhaps survival itself had worn them down. Or perhaps for the first time, they had seen the truth in what she spoke, that family was choice, not name. In the weeks that followed, the valley shifted like soil, tilled for spring. Old grudges softened, if not forgotten, their edges dulled by necessity and the shame of having been deceived. Men who once crossed the street to avoid each other now stood side by side at the blacksmith's fire. Women exchanged recipes across fences that had once been battlegrounds. The peace was fragile, yes, but it was growing roots. Josie, no longer hiding, stepped forward into the life she wanted. It was her idea to open a schoolhouse, a place where children of both clans might sit together and learn letters rather than the language of hate. At first the proposal was met with hesitation, but her quiet persistence won them over. She spoke of her own childhood, of the hunger she had carried for belonging, and the way knowledge had been a candle in her darkness. If they can learn together, she said, they can live together. Eli threw himself into the work of building it. His hands calloused from carpentry-shaped beams and planed boards until the small structure took shape on a rise overlooking the valley. Tommy shadowed him every step, fetching nails, holding planks steady, his eyes bright with pride each time Eli ruffled his hair in thanks. And in the evenings, when the tools were put away, Josie sat at the rough-hewn table teaching the boy his letters. He stumbled at first, tongue-tripping over sounds, but she praised every attempt. Slowly the words began to form under his hand, and the light in his eyes grew steadier. The work bound them together, man, woman, and boy. Not bound by blood, but by something stronger, choice, trust, and a shared vision of what might be. Delilah even came by once, her shawl pulled close against the cold. She brought books, a quiet offering for the school. Josie accepted them with a nod. No words exchanged, but in that moment, she saw a woman trying in her own way to begin again. Winter deepened. The prairie stretched white and endless, the tall grass bending under the weight of snow. At dusk, smoke rose from chimneys across the valley, no longer signals of suspicion, but simple signs of life. Josie would stand at the porch sometimes, watching the horizon blur into pale sky, her heart quieter than it had ever been. One evening, as flakes drifted slow and silent, Eli joined her at the rail, his coat dusted with sawdust and snow alike. Tommy lingered nearby, holding a slate tablet on which he had scrawled his name letters, uneven but proud. He ran to Josie, showing her with a grin that stretched ear to ear. She laughed softly, smoothing his hair, the sound ringing out clear in the frozen air. Eli turned toward her, then his eyes steady, the same eyes that had watched her break at the altar months ago. He didn't speak at first, but she knew what lingered between them. She reached for his hand, and he took it warm and sure. Her gaze lifted to the falling snow, the quiet world spread before them. For the first time since her vows, her lips curved into a smile, unforced, unguarded, wholly her own. It bloomed through her sorrow, like the first wildflower after thaw. Eli's breath caught, and his thumb brushed over her knuckles. He leaned closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Told you, Josie. One day." She turned to him fully, her smile radiant against the pale dusk. "And today is that day." Tommy wedged himself between them, then clutching her skirt with one hand, and Eli's coat with the other, as if afraid they might slip away. The three of them stood together, the boys' laughter mixing with the hush of snow, their figures outlined against the endless white. The wind moved through the tall grass, soft and unthreatening, now carrying not the sound of feud or fear, but of promise. A home, a family, a future of their own making. Josie held tighter to the hands in hers and lifted her face to the sky. At last the whisper given in a chapel filled with tears had come true. She was smiling, and she knew she would never stop. Out here on the Dakota Plains, folks used to say blood was the only bond that mattered. But Josie proved something truer. Family is the people who stay, who choose you even when the world tries to turn away. Watching her stand tall, and Eli keep his promise, I couldn't help but think maybe that's the real victory in the Wild West. Not the land, not the cattle, not even the end of a feud. It's the quiet triumph of love and belonging. And for the first time, Josie smiled, and it was worth every mile of sorrow that brought her there.